even taking this beyond injury, the other thing that I really think, maybe this goes back to your question of what the NCAA can do better, a very small percentage of collegiate athletes are going to go on to that next level. We need to do a better job of preparing them for what life is like outside the sport, because they may not know what that is or know how to be no longer that sport. And so
Well, thank you for being willing to be here. I have a series of questions to ask you, and I think the students will benefit from your experience. This is a sport performance enhancement class.
okay.
And so one of the units that we're doing is recovery from injury and return to play, and how that's a crucial and sometimes overlooked component of sports performance. In other words, sometimes I think in programs and in situations and in strength and conditioning groups, we assume that everything is always going to occur in a linear fashion, and that there won't be any setbacks. And the reality is, especially with team sports where you've got a lot of athletes that dictate the overall performance of the team, injury is an unavoidable component. And so factoring that in, preparing for that, trying to prevent it, and then when it occurs, to try and treat it properly and in a safe and healthy way so they can come back stronger and reduce the risk of re-injury is really important. And that's something that I want to make sure we cover this week. And that's why I thought your perspective would be so helpful, not just for the actual experiences you've had with athletes and with teams and with coaches, but also the training that you give students. So my conversation today is with Dr. Kassee Hildenbrand. She is an associate professor of athletic training at Washington State University, and she directs the athletic training program. And she's also one of the most accomplished professionals I've ever met in this field, and someone that has a true gift working with students and with athletes. So my first question to you, Kassee, is in your line of work, in your experiences that you have had, what are a few of the crucial exercise training factors that you have observed that facilitate either performance or facilitate return from injury? So I guess I'm speaking generally here, and in regards to more to the actual exercise training part of athletes.
So I think a couple things. One, I think there's been a growing awareness on how we have to focus on the function of the rehabilitation and exercise that we're giving them. If they're not functional to the actual sport that they're going to play, then it doesn't matter. So I think, initially maybe you start with something, simple that, you might just see in the weight room, but at some point we have to incorporate it to be more functional, which means including the things like agility, and a lot of those other factors. And I think honestly, that's the part where athletic trainers really, I think we excel in that particular area, because we kind of get to take our curiosity and creativeness and apply it to rehab to really, figure out what it is that they actually need to be able to do functionally on the field. And then how can we make, the either prevention programs or getting them back to their sport as functional as possible to that particular activity, if that makes sense. The second part is I do think there's a huge mental component that needs to go into this. And I think there's a lot of awareness now about the idea that, we can't just address their physical readiness to return to play. There has to be their mental readiness to return to play, because sometimes you may have somebody that you're working with, and as an athletic trainer, functionally and strength and everything wise, I'm like, you're ready to go back, but they're hesitant for some reason, or they're not, and you got to make sure that you're listening to those signs and those cues so that you can make sure we're addressing the mental component, which is going to include, again, really establishing a lot of confidence in that their body is going to do what it did before, and hopefully even do it better than it did it before.
That's great, thank you. And as a follow-up to that, do you feel there are, what you just described, do you feel there are differences in that among different kinds of athletes? say you've got, the aerobic athletes or the anaerobic athletes or the individual sport athletes or the team sport athletes, do you see, I know we just talked about that sort of in general, but do you see and have you seen differences within the different kinds of athletes or maybe even sport specific athletes?
I definitely do think that there needs to be specificity, but I think what you might also see sometimes is then they end up being so specific that we forget that there needs to be just sort of a general underlying fitness level too. So I think an example sometimes is, if you take like a lineman on the football field, and sometimes people are like, well, why would they ever need to do any cardio? Because all they're doing is pushing people, and they push them for a very short distance. Well, that's true, and we want to make sure that we're really functionally preparing them for that role. We're also asking them to do it at high enough reps throughout a game that we can't sort of then ignore the whole cardiovascular, um, you know, fitness and function as well. I think, or sometimes with our endurance athletes, you might be like, well, why would you ever put them in the weight room? Why would you have a swimmer, or a cross country runner in the weight room? But I think it's that same idea. We're trying to increase as functionally as possible, but also, give overall general fitness, strength, cardiovascular stuff to people. So like, I think, a great thing that we can do for like our runners is a lot of, walking lunges and that sort of stuff. They're never necessarily going to perform it in that function, but we want to make sure that that the joints are strong enough to be able to support that type of activity for a variety of terrains and that kind of stuff. And then I think the other big area that should always be worked on is balance, regardless of what, sport or activity or repetitive thing or functional thing. And of course, balance kind of starts at the core. So making sure that we're taking care of that core as well to make sure that anything crazy that we're asking our appendages can do are kind of starting from that solid, stable, kind of from a biomechanical purpose as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Okay, so the next question that I would like to ask is, outside of exercise training, which I really appreciate your answers there, what factors do you think are most important for competitive athletes in order for them to perform well and maybe recover from injury? What beyond exercise training, what's most essential for athletes?
I think it's going to come back a little bit to that mental component, but I also think more than that, it's their sense of knowing that they still matter, that they're still connected to the team. They still have a place on the team, and there's still a purpose for them when they come back. I think sometimes there's sort of this sort of they're cut from the herd mentality when they're injured. And, I know within our athletic training program, we talk a lot about still integrating athletes that are recovering from injury as much as we can in the team activities. So, they shouldn't do their rehab in isolation in the athletic training room. They need to be doing it on the sidelines with their teammates. Put them in as many drills as you possibly can, safely. Figure out how to modify things. Because I think that, again, it's, they need to see the larger purpose that they're still, what they're working so hard to get back to. And if they feel like they've been cut from that, or they're not sort of connected, then I think some of that, the joy and passion that they got originally from joining their sport can get lost. And I think that can get really hard. So I know within our AT program, we talk a lot about, again, ways to integrate them as much as possible still in the team. And if sometimes there can't be there's limitations because like they maybe can't travel with the team, which can be there's a financial cost for traveling somebody who's not going to actually participate in your team. But at the same point, I think it's one of the best things you could do mentally for that player is so that they still feel like they're a part of the team, come up with a new role. And if they do get left behind, then sometimes we need to connect them either with other athletes that are going through a rehabilitation so that we can kind of create a little sub-herd of players that are going through some of those same things, or sometimes it's up to us that are working with them to become that support system while we're working so hard to get back to that sport.
Yeah. How much, this is a question I hadn't planned on asking, but I loved your response. How much do athletic trainers on a daily basis work with athletes who are recovering from injury to try to get them to stop being fearful of a second injury or something that's going to happen to them again? I know you're not a psychologist, and I know strength and conditioning coaches aren't psychologists, But I also know that there's this period for many athletes where physically and physiologically and maybe anatomically, they're fit to resume activities again, but they are not able to perform to the same level. And some of that is based on a fear of re-injury. Um, Whereas before they had that serious injury, maybe they wouldn't have had that perspective. So how much do athletic trainers have to work with athletes on that? And do you feel they're unqualified to do that? In a sense, I
I would
guess.
say it's probably far more common than we realized. Up till previous years ago, we sort of have a mantra within our teachings that everything is perfectly reasonable. You just have to figure out why. And usually, athletes that are not ready to come back, I mean, they're not going to come out and say that, but you can pick up on their science based off of their behavior, or based off of how they're approaching things. And so, as long as and again, as long as you're open to listening and you're paying attention and you're not only self-reflecting on your own part in this, but theirs, and trying to figure out we're not psychologists, but we can usually pick up on when they're hesitant to go back for those reasons. And initially, I don't think it's bad that maybe we focus on the physical side of doing that, but I think at some point we have to realize that those really go hand in hand. Um, and sometimes I think it is something that just, we as athletic trainers, we have a skill set, we can figure out how to help them break through that. And other times it may be beyond our scope, in which case we would need to get them to somebody who is qualified to help with that particular component. One thing that I think is becoming a little more prevalent in is, athletes can actually develop a version of PTSD from an injury. And it may be that, they're fine until they smell the grass. And then that reminds them of when they tore their ACL, and suddenly that elicits a lot of those physiologic responses that we tend to see in PTSD type situations. Obviously that's something that, we can be, empathetic and help provide support for, but that's probably not something that by ourselves we're going to, be qualified to help them with. And so again, I think it's just that paying attention. Another thing, we actually teach a lot of our psychosocial from an attachment theory perspective, with the idea of developing that secure attachment. And I think if you can be successful in developing that, then hopefully that level of trust is there between you and your patient.
Fantastic, thank you. Another general question for you. What are some of the most important lessons you have learned in your roles over the years as you have worked with athletes? What are some of the most important things you've learned about working with them? Because their goal is to perform well. Their goal is to stay healthy. And I think most of the time athletes see you and your team as assets, people that can help them. But what I'm asking is, what would you not find in a textbook? What's most important in working with these
I think
people?
With, I don't know, age, wisdom, experience, those sorts of things, some of the things that stand out to me, and I was actually just listening to a podcast that was talking about this, and I think one of the things that we maybe lose the most as we progress through our career and that sort of stuff is we tend to lose our curiosity. Sometimes because we feel like, well, we've seen it before and we're just going to continue to deal with it. And I think in athletic training, one of the things I've really realized, you have to be curious all the time to really be, I think, successful. The 27th ankle sprain is probably going to be the time that it's not an ankle sprain. It was something else. And we had to be curious enough to be able to still be thorough enough in our evaluation to find out the subtleties that are different, that maybe are going to make it look different. So I think curiosity is a big one. I think creativity is big. I think I remember a few years ago, I listened to a presentation by one of our athletic trainers that was working with he predominantly was working preventatively and then injury rehab with our quarterbacks. And at Washington State University with our former football coach in the air raid offense, you have to attack your prevention program for a quarterback in an air raid offense completely differently than you would you would deal with a prevention program for a quarterback who is in primarily more of a run offense or something like that, because the amount of reps of throwing that are happening are just, they're astronomical compared to a typical, quarterback. And so, one of the things I really took away from was just that idea of, again, you've got to be creative in how you're going, how you're going to manage that. How are you going to prevent a repetitive shoulder injury in somebody who's basically set up for a repetitive, shoulder injury? I think empathy is something that cannot ever be oversold as being important. I think you mentioned, I don't want to be the athletic trainer that they're fearful to see me, because if they see me, then they know they're hurt. I want them to see me when they're not hurt, so that we have enough of a trust that then when they see me when they're hurt, then we've already established that relationship, so that it's not sort of this doom and gloom, oh my gosh, I have to go see that person because it means I'm hurt. So I think sometimes working through, some of those things on the front end can then make our job a little bit easier on the back end.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I'm going to ask you two questions next. One kind of follows up on the first. In general, what areas do you feel that sports performance teams, organizations, facilities, in what areas do they need to change and adapt and become more progressive to reduce athlete injury? And then the follow-up question, I'd like to ask you about Division I specifically, so athletic departments. But I guess this is more of a general question about, here's what we know in athletic training. Sometimes in sport, they're not following all of the procedures that are taught, and sometimes it takes a while for some of that stuff to carry over. So where do they need to become more progressive and more current?
I think it's on the prevention side. And the reason I think the prevention is so important is, I think in general, and again, I know we're talking about athletes, but in general in society, we're not very good at preventative care. Like our whole healthcare model is not set up really for preventative, right? It's, you kind of get your one visit and then that's it. And then we tend to be more reactionary. Like we'll approve things after you've already got it, but we're not going to, we're not going to educate you about diabetes, but if you get it, then we'll treat it. And so I think in general, it's more this idea of prevention. And I think the thing that goes with prevention is letting athletes know that it's okay to be injured. It's okay to need time to recover. Everybody does. And so in some ways, I think and I don't know how to break through that mindset, but, I think, and I don't know if you were leading me down this pathway, but I think concussions is a good example. Nobody really wants to talk about it because, we know that what really helps a concussion recovery is rest. Well, that's asking people to do something they don't want to do. And so that leads to all of the, well, we're going to hide the symptoms, or we're not going to, we're going to bend the rules and we're going to slide it and that kind of stuff. And so I think some of it's just, and I don't know how to do this, but, getting the culture to change a little bit to realize that it's okay. There's a few surgeries out there that you come back stronger than you were before you had it. So like Tommy John surgery is one example. Most baseball pitchers that have had that surgery will actually come back. I mean, it's a long 18-month recovery, but they'll come back and they can throw faster than they did before they had the surgery. But again, it's an 18-month recovery. And so, I don't think anybody's signing up yet for free Tommy John surgery, knowing that they can throw faster. But it's like, we need to get to the point where sometimes, an injury is an opportunity to figure out what's not working and then make it better, instead of an injury is a time that now I'm out and I'm cut from my herd and I can't perform and I might get, I think there's just so much fear tied into the injury side of things that something in the preventative side needs to address some of those fears. I don't know if I have an answer for what that is though.
Okay, that's great. That's great insight. And now specific to Division I athletic departments and programs, you've seen it all. You've seen, how many years have you been here at WSU now?
I just finished my 14th.
You just finished your 14th year, and before that, you were at a few different universities. And for you students out there listening, Dr. Hildenbrand is extremely active in athletic training organizations. She's been in many leadership roles. She knows everybody in the business and everybody knows her. Um, and that's a testament to the person that she is and the contacts that she has. So you've talked, if you haven't experienced it here at WSU, you've experienced it vicariously, and you've heard people talking about it. So NCAA and athletic programs here, there's a lot of variability, but where do they need to adapt and improve to ensure the safety of athletes and to ensure optimal performance? Is it just in terms of preventing injury, or does it go beyond that, do you feel?
So I think it does go beyond that, but I don't know quite where exactly that line should be drawn. I think part of the reason that fear is something that is so driven within the sports of injuries and stuff is because the stakes are so high. And so I think in some ways it's figuring out how to not make the stakes so high, but I don't know that that's possible given, you know, the current state of affairs. You know, I mean, there are people that have chosen sport as their way to try to get themselves out of the circumstances that they, you know, they grew up in, and to get their family out of those circumstances. That puts incredibly high pressure and stakes on that particular individual. I don't know if they can hear the message of, you know, protecting your brain and making sure that, you know, we're not causing lifelong harm. I just don't know if that is possible. I do think the NCAA has taken some steps in the right direction. I think rule changes are not the only answer, but they are part of the answer. You know, I think they've attempted to make rules, but again, rules can be interpreted. And I think, you know, for every, you know, we certainly don't want one of our players called for targeting, but we're, you know, more than unhappy enough to yell at the TV when, you know, we think a player has targeted one of our players. You know, and I think, I mean, targeting calls, again, that was the NCAA's response to try to eliminate some of the most dangerous hits that happen in football. But fundamentally, the point of football is to tackle people and get the ball away from them. And so that's, you know, we can't necessarily figure out a rule to take away the you know, point of the game. I think things like shortening the kickoff, those are all things that are steps in the right direction, but that can't be all that we do. And then it trickles down to refs that can then enforce the rules properly and know when to make those calls, which, you know, I mean, even those of us that, you know, watch the game, we have the benefit of usually getting instant replays where we can see it and they break it down to us in slow mo. Sometimes refs don't have that benefit. They have to make a split second call, and, you know, sometimes they get it right and sometimes they get it wrong. So I think it's a combination of things. I think the money component, honestly, is part of the problem too. I mean, you know, if I knew that I went into the professional leagues and I was only going to make this much money, then maybe I would decide the risk wasn't worth it. But if I can make millions and millions of dollars, then I might decide the risk is worth it. And so, you know, I think it's unfortunately a big question. And I think those of us that are in the system, our job is to do the best we can to have the patient or athlete's best interest in mind. And sometimes that can be telling them things they don't want to hear. And sometimes it's really figuring out how to support them getting through that particular injury or that process. So I think for me personally, it comes down to, I can't get too thought up in the global picture because it can seem really overwhelming. And so the only person I can affect is the person that I'm actually helping or dealing with at that moment. And so how can I, you know, make sure that whatever care we're providing is really in their best interest? And sometimes I have to listen to what they think their best interest is, even if it would differ than my own decision.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. So final question here, and this is kind of a big one. What are 2 or 3 things that you have learned over your 15 or 16 years since you finished school about working with athletes and about training students to work with athletes that you did not know when you graduated? We all like to think we know everything when we finish school, but what are some things that have been so crucial that you have learned about empowering athletes and helping them be safe and keeping them in a healthy space to recover, that you didn't know when you first started?
I think one of the biggest things is that I didn't realized that I would learn far more from them than I think I've ever taught them. So, I think that, when you decide to become a teacher, and not that I ever thought I was the expert, but I think you quickly realize that I'm nowhere, I'm not the expert. It's my job to pay attention and learn from others, and then hopefully guide them along their way. I think another big thing is that you have to be willing to make adjustments, constantly, because usually the best laid plans are going to fly out the window. And then you got to be prepared for adjusting. And if you become so inflexible, then it can get really hard to sort of move with things. And I think the thing is, especially, the athlete population and the college students that I deal with, they're in an age group where there's a lot of change that's happening even in them. Part of what I really like is I love seeing, the AT student that starts out and they had the reason why they wanted to do it, and then seeing them graduate and how their why changed, or became deeper or more meaningful over time. I think the other thing that, and this probably, it was really only a few years ago that it really dawned on me. When I get really frustrated by something, it's usually more of an issue with me than an issue with them, which takes some self-reflection on your part, and you have to be willing to do that. But so like one example was, we kept getting feedback from people that some of our students just, they weren't showing initiative. And so we would be like, well, did you give them that feedback? And they're like, yeah, we told them they need to show more initiative. And they said, oh, okay, they would. Well, I kept getting frustrated because it's like, this isn't changing. And I think through realizing that my frustration was probably because I wasn't being clear in my expectations, and they didn't know what initiative was. At least not what my version of initiative was and what I wanted them to be able to demonstrate. And so when we got to the point where we could really break down what initiative was and what I wanted them to do, it was so satisfying to see that most people are able to achieve that. I think, again, it was not because they can't be initiative. I just don't think they knew what we were asking for. And so that was one big thing that sort of made me realize that sometimes it's not them that's frustrating. It's my ability to express what I want that is frustrating because it's not being met. And so I think that can be applied to athletes and athletics, as well. And so, I think I can lay out a perfect rehabilitation plan. I mean, it is so pretty, and we're going to hit timelines and we're going to go. And sometimes I can get really sidetracked by the fact that I'm really frustrated because maybe it seems like this person really isn't, they're late to their appointments, or they're not showing up, or they're doing that. And I need to let go of the fact that they're not following my perfect plan. And I need to go figure out what's going on that's preventing them from following my perfect plan. And then I'm probably going to need to come up with at least one more plan, if not several more, from that point. And I can really save myself a lot of frustration and energy by willing to make those adjustments, instead of just spending weeks venting to people about how frustrated I am with this particular plan. So I don't know if that was more philosophical than you wanted, but I think those were some of those things that, I think we just have to be willing. You got to make adjustments. And, I really like to plan. Chris, you can probably attest, like, that may be my superhuman power. Can't plan life. And so sometimes you got to figure out how to make adjustments and be okay with that, and kind of go on the fly. And I think COVID-19 is a perfect example. I don't think anybody did this, and I'm now writing, pandemic policies in my policies and procedure manuals, and, you just got to go with it.
Yeah, that's great. And to that point, do you feel that it's easier for some athletes to be flexible when they have an injury than others? I mean, I don't have near as much experience with you working with college athletes, but there's been a few that I've known that they love their sport or competition or both so much, and so much of their identity is wrapped up in how they perform, how they are doing. And for some of them, for the better part of 10 years, that's been the focal point of who they are. And then suddenly to have a serious ACL injury or concussion trouble or whatever, and they have a really hard time adjusting. Some of them, others do great, and others are like, well, I'm okay, and we'll be better. But some really have a hard time, and it's very frustrating. And so has that been your observation also?
Yeah, I think again, it comes back a little bit to that idea of athletic identity. If they don't know who they are outside their sport and their sport is gone, then they're going to struggle more with this injury idea. If you have somebody who sport is just one component of their identity and they feel confident in other areas, they may have an easier time, adjusting to that. And I think even taking this beyond injury, the other thing that I really think, maybe this goes back to your question of what the NCAA can do better, a very small percentage of collegiate athletes are going to go on to that next level. We need to do a better job of preparing them for what life is like outside the sport, because they may not know what that is or know how to be no longer that sport. And so I think that's another area that, again, just being on the lookout for the individuals that sport seems to be their big thing, and trying to work with them to establish other ways to see themselves or have an identity can be really important.
Yeah. What about working with coaches? How, you smile, how easy or how productive has it been for you in your experience working with coaches? Are they understanding of a rehabilitation plan for athletes? Are they understanding of what the athlete is going through for the most part? In other words, do they value athletic training's contribution to the team most of the
I
time?
definitely think there are coaches out there who feel that way, and value it. And then I think, unfortunately, there's coaches out there who don't. I think, again, trying to apply my same logic as we use to athletes of everything's perfectly reasonable. You know, Coaches, especially at the Division I level, there's a lot on the line for them as well, right? I mean, you know, some of these salaries that we pay football coaches can seem ridiculous, but if my entire livelihood to support my family depended on my ability to get a bunch of 18 to 24-year-olds to come together and beat another team of them, I would probably be a highly stressed out, you know, somewhat person too. So I think, again, it just depends on where the coaches fall. I don't think it used to be that coaches could coach at a school and they would be there forever, right? They had security and they had longevity. And so they could write out a particular injury, or set of circumstances. Now, you don't win, you're gone is not a great mentality for them to be able to afford a lot of that, kindness and support and stuff, even if they're incredibly kind and supportive people. Um, I think there are a lot of coaches out there who do, and I think they're good people, and they want their athletes to be healthy, and they want to give them that time to recover, and they want to be supportive. And again, it just depends on the circumstances, I think, outside of them, and whether or not they're able to, live those values or be that way. I think the coaching at the Division I level is just more cutthroat. It takes a lot to get to that level, and then it's a lot to stay at that level. I think, in a lot of the lower levels, it's maybe, again, a bit more, they have a bit more leniency to be able to, you know, be that type of coach and be able to support their athletes as people and not look at them as an, way for them to achieve their winning goals. So I think it's just a line. And I think there are a lot of people that would be incredible coaches, even at the Division I level, that have chosen not, to be at that level because they know that they're not going to be able to do it. And then I think there's incredible coaches that can be at that level. I think, and every coach is going to have flaws, but I think, Pete Carroll, I think, is somebody who's been able to do a lot of that. And I think if you talk to some of his, former players, the culture that he was able to create, it was more than just what they did on the field. In Seattle, I think they were able to do more as actual people outside of that too. I think, John Wooden, there's lots of examples of incredible coaches, that were able to kind of do that at that level. So I think it takes somebody who's going to have those strong convictions and be able to kind of survive in the environment that unfortunately gets created at some of the institutions.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for your time, Kassee. We appreciate your insight and your wisdom. And yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Good luck.
Thanks. We'll talk later.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.